Welcome to a BW Dialogue in partnership with Executive Access. Today we are talking about the most important thing that corporate India needs, which is the role of independent directors. How do they add value during crisis and hopefully post-crisis? Crisis is always a great time to look at, inside and evaluate what one is doing right as an institution, as a company, and as a leader. Good evening, everyone. We have a very exciting session coming up with some of the best minds in the industry to discuss how boards can add value in a crisis. And today, many industries and companies are in deep crisis. Some recognize, some not recognize. Sunandan, why don't you tell us a bit about why this session and who's on this session?
Yeah, absolutely. But, I want to start with a quote I saw this morning, and I thought it's very relevant this evening as well, by Herman Melville. It says, it is better to fail in originality than to succeed in imitation. And it is relevant because this evening we have a very august panel. We are in August as well. Who have not just excelled in their field, but created a name for themselves for their original thinking, So all the independent directors we have on our panel today have not only great experience, but they are also great visionaries in their respective field. So let's introduce them. Anurag, why don't you start?
Sunandan, why don't you start with somebody who's really preeminent? All four are super preeminent, but we have to start with one person. So
let me start with Bhaskar. Bhaskar Pramanik, Senior Advisor, Rothschild and Company, Board Member and Independent Director, TCNS Clothing Company Limited, former Chairperson, Microsoft India, former Board Member, State Bank of India. Anurag.
Thank you so much. Sunandan, dare I say, today when we are talking of boards and leaders, our panel is equally represented by female leaders and male leaders. Though leadership does not recognize, what gender you are, but in the spirit of equality, in the spirit of inclusion
right.
of boards, and we had to bring in a legislation to say that we should have more women board members. In that context, let me introduce our second guest. Her name is Miss Neelam Dhawan. I don't think she needs an introduction, but just to be meticulous about it, she's the chairperson of the India Advisory Board of IBM. She's also on the Royal Philips Netherlands board. She's on the board of ICICI Bank. She's on the board of Yatra. So she herself ran a company. The beauty about all the four panelists, while they're on boards today, but they've run very large corporations. So they've had to report to the board. They've had to report to the chairperson of the board. So they understand the distinction between management and boards, which is what also we will discuss during the seminar.
Absolutely. Very well said. Sukanya Kripalu, Independent Director of UltraTech Cement, Colgate India, Aditya Birla Fashion and Retail Entertainment Network, and Aditya Birla Health Insurance. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming.
Last but not the least.
Happy to be here.
Thank you, Sukanya. Last but not the least, we have Mr. Kaushik Dutta. Right now, he's the director of the Thought Arbitrage Research Institute and former member, India Leadership Team, PwC, and partner Global Capital Markets Group. He's also independent director on SCL Infosystems Limited, on Newgen Software, on SI Inc., on NDTV, on Zomato's board, NSL's board, and on Renewable Power's board. So a diverse set of companies, diverse set of issues to deal with, whether regulatory or market oriented. Welcome, Mr. Dutta.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming. In fact, the agenda for this evening is to discuss what we think is a very critical issue today. So how do boards respond to crisis? How is it different during crisis, especially like the one we are going through right now? And therefore, Anurag, you want to set the ball rolling?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, often boards are expected to do a lot, and they do a lot. But in times of crisis, CEOs and managing directors and leaders of the companies possibly are seeking boards' inputs and viewpoints more than they ever did. So the role of boards have got accentuated in the last 4 months. There are more strategic decisions to be taken. There are decisions that are tough. So you need wise counsel more than ever. let me say
Absolutely.
that one of the things that we want to discuss, and let's set the ball rolling with that, is how independent are the independent directors? Are, inside the boardroom, outside the boardroom? So let us start with Bhaskar's inputs on how independent are independent directors. And let me ask, how do they really exert their opinions and their informed viewpoints on the other directors, especially in times of crisis like this? Because if they don't do it now, there might be an existential crisis. The companies may not exist, some companies, without taking the sectors, which sectors we are talking of. So Bhaskar, we'd like you to start by giving your opening comments on how independent are the independent board members.
I think you're using the word independent in perhaps the wrong context. Independence, as defined by the regulatory authority, is where you do not have any kind of a pecuniary relationship with the organization or with the company or with any of the management team, etc. So therefore, independence is not independence of thinking; it's independence from a monetary perspective. So I think that's really the definition of independence.
But in spite of there being independent directors, sometimes they are not able to be. That's the point. Of course, we know that.
The boards I've been in, and I think that is really the hallmark of great boards, is independence, but at the same time being part of the overall board. Board functions not because of a few great independent members, but it is because of the combination of both management, independent directors, the executive directors, nominee directors. I think it's a teamwork, and it is really orchestrated through the chairman. So as a member or as a board member, you are expected to give your views because that's why you're on the board. It is a function of your experience, your capabilities. It is also sometimes your professional knowledge, which you may be good at. For example, in most of the boards I've been on, the subject of technology always comes up. And especially when you look at the future, how can you technology enable parts of the business? Those are the areas where people will look to be. But I think the role of an independent board member is not to give his opinion. It is to actually ask the right questions. I think there is what is called a healthy skepticism to what management prepares. There has to be respect for management because they are the people on the ground. They are the ones in touch with the employees on a day-to-day basis, with the other stakeholders, with customers. And therefore, you have to accept their inputs. What is important is basically to provide them that healthy skepticism, but at the same time, a certain amount of moral support, especially when you're in the time of a crisis. So I'll end here, but
you're saying the board member needs to be a devil's advocate, so to say. Ask all the uncomfortable questions so that
yes,
all angles
ask
are
the uncomfortable questions. But like I said, it is also in terms of being supportive, and it's not about insisting upon your own view or opinion. It is also about accommodating the views of the others. Because like I keep saying, being on a board is actually a team sport, except that you get together for very short periods of time, not for longer periods of time. You get there for short periods of time, and then you have to solve certain set of problems. When you have a crisis like the pandemic, it actually makes it very difficult because you're not in a position to constantly keep monitoring what is happening. But that's where your role has changed a little, because then there are more individual meetings, more separate phone calls, and sometimes as the chairman will ask you to get involved in very specific areas. But we can talk about that separately.
This is such an important issue, and I think we should get everybody's point of view on this. Can we maybe start with Sukanya? Would you like to say a few things about this? What's your point of view?
So I believe there are, when you ask a question like how independent are independent directors, frankly, there are organizations and organizations. In a few years ago, independent directors were really friends of management. And I'm not running down any company by saying that, but the idea was that you had people you knew on the board, etc., etc. Then it became that much harder to ask difficult questions. I think over a period of time, and I must say in my experience, we've the construct of independent directors and boards have been changing over time. And as a result, you get people from different skill sets, different walks of life, and who really are not beholden to the management for the position in which they're in. Mm-hmm. And to take off from what Bhaskar was saying, that lets you ask constructive questions. Yep. The idea is not to be, what should I say, you can't do the job of the management. An independent director's role is really to ask the right questions in a constructive fashion. And the point is, you must question what you think is right and have the courage of conviction to actually ask, even if it's a little bit uncomfortable. That's what I would say the role of the independent directors.
Yeah, fabulous. Kaushik?
This is a debate that has been going on for as long as the Office of Independent Director has been. In India, we call it independent directors, but from where this whole concept of independent directors came in, which is the US, they call them external directors. So, if you're external as compared to the management, that's the whole role. So if you take, leaving that aside, the challenge is, you can either be an activist, or you can, or on the other extreme, you become a cheerleader for the management. The whole purpose of being a good independent director is to create the balance. And what you do as an independent director over your whole life in a company is that you actually participate in a decision making. At the end of the day, whatever discussions that happen has to end up in a decision, right? Whether it's an approving of a budget, whether it's a merger, whether it's an acquisition, whether it's in these days, whether it's how do you rationalize costs, whatever, technology. So these are actually, at the end of the day, is a decision. And every director plays different roles because of your area of expertise. For instance, when I sit in an audit committee, I'm a financial expert. And that's exactly the liability I pick up, because I'm, as a financial expert in an audit committee, I need to do everything under my care that the financial statements are true and fair from an oversight point of view. While taking those decisions, there are two rules that we follow. And this is where the law comes in. You have a duty of loyalty and you have a duty of care. The duty of loyalty means that whatever you do, you would never compromise the interests of the company, and the company being the artificial self. So no conflict of interest. So you take always an independent decision. And duty of care is like you take every decision based on utmost diligence as a normal person you would do. So these questions that you ask, what information you need, this all goes to satisfy your duty of loyalty and your duty of care. And to discharge your duties as an independent director, you've got to have all of this documented, including documenting your dissent, because the role of the independent directors actually in the law says that you've got to express your dissent and have that documented, or if you agree, you've got to give the basis for your agreement. So in a nutshell, what it is that whatever decision you take has to be reasoned, has to be logical, has to be based on facts and circumstances, and at the end of the day, you're signing off, so you stand by it. So the other thing is that as a board, you work as a collegium, not as individuals. And so in a collegium, it's everyone works together to come to the best possible solutions under the circumstances.
Before I move on to Neelam, Kaushik, tell me, the question really is in the Indian context, how independent are the independent directors in real life today, in the Indian context?
It's a personal choice to be independent. Independent means, when does the independence come into question is when you have a conflict of interest, right? When there is a conflict of interest between let's say, a promoter and the interest of the other shareholders. At that point of time, when you're standing in the middle, how you actually hold the moral compass is how you discharge your duties. And that's the time in which you stand up for the office that you stand up for, of the independent director. So it is not a question of, on everyday basis, you're not an activist asking questions. It's your duty is challenged, or your role is challenged when there's a conflict, and how you actually stand up and resolve in the conflict of interest, every stakeholder's interest. That's your test. That's your true test. Like a good example I can give you that in related party transactions, how do you determine related party transactions with the promoter group outside of subsidiaries are done in the best interest of the company.
Neelam,
Yes, Sunandan.
let's hear from you.
Thank you very much for having me on the panel, and it's really
Thank
interesting. In my view, independent directors are appointed by the shareholders. Every time a board is constituted, the members are appointed by the shareholders, and as a result, the board is a kind of a body representing the shareholders' interest to the company. And hence, you have an obligation to ensure that you're giving the right guidance, you're asking the right questions, and you're working in a manner where you are a representative of the shareholder. I think the fundamental definition that you are not appointed by the management, but by the shareholders makes you independent itself in saying, I can express, whether supportive or as Kaushik said, as an activist, your own point of view in every board. I think we will do disservice if you are what we sometimes is referred to the old time biscuit and chai directors who would come in and say, not speak up, just have some tea and biscuits and go away. Well, that world is gone, because even management expects the board members to add value to them. So, having said that, I personally believe independent directors are fairly independent in India as well as overseas.
Fantastic.
Okay. Sunandan, I want to ask two questions. They're both related.
Yep.
If we broadly divide the role of the board into three, one is operational, which is the management decisions, but ratifying some of those operational decisions which may have a P&L impact, strategic decisions which are primarily about future, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, depending on what industry, what is the life stage of your company. And third being, which I may call compliance. Compliance over the last decade has become a big issue, right? So tell me, where does your time go most? Where, I'm talking you're representative of an external independent director. Second question I want to ask is that very importantly, when the company is not doing well or can do well, the board is more involved. What about when the company is doing very well? How does the role change in both these situations? Ideally, it should be the same, but when you tend to do well, all of us tend to be a little complacent. So I just want input from, we can start with Ms. Dhawan, first you, and then we can go around the house. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much. Anurag, that's a very pertinent question. Good times or bad times? I think we are always questioning the company's strategy. This is the irony of the whole situation. We meet quarterly to discuss quarterly results, and that's a mandate which is given by SEBI and others that you need to look at quarterly results. Yes, we do. But most boards meet for annual strategy meetings. And every meeting, after you've discussed the results and done away with the governance issues, it becomes, if the time is good, it becomes, how can you grow faster? What is your growth strategy? Where do you want to invest? And what are you planning to do so that we can be returning wealth to the shareholders? That's the conversation. In bad times, and COVID has really shown very difficult time to many industries. In fact, every industry is seeing difficult times. The question then does not change. What is our strategy? How do we need to change in today's time? And where are we going to go in 3 months or 6 months? Where is the cash flow? What does it look like? How long can we sustain at the level of business we are in? I think it's more or less related discussions. So as I think Bhaskar said, it's a team sport. And I agree with him. We don't spend enough time because every company has, 4 quarterly board meetings, 1 strategy meeting. Maybe we meet once in between to have a conversation around talent. But is that sufficient? However, the discussions are more than what is statutorily required for us to do. So fiduciary responsibility is much less time as much as strategy takes more discussion. That's how I see it.
Okay, Mr. Pramanik, your response.
Yeah, so, I was on the board of the State Bank of India.
Yes.
And frankly, being a public sector bank, India's largest bank, the amount of time we spent on regulatory and compliance related was actually very, very high. In fact, the PJ Naik report, I think it was 2008, actually said that one of the biggest challenges which public sector banks and even private sector banks have to that extent is that a lot of the focus is on really the regulatory compliance part of it, and very little time is actually spent on strategy. And that to me is really very, very critical, because, and it's not just at the board level. My experience in most Indian companies has been that there is 80% of the organization is focused on the present. It's today's problems, today's issues, how do I resolve it? And everybody is sort of, just constantly being engaged in that.
And the quarterly results are important.
The quarterly
important
results are very important. 6 monthly annual results are important. And there are very few people who are actually looking at, what I call tomorrow, which is how will I grow my business? What should be my new products and services? What new markets should I be in? And frankly, there's very few people in India who's really looking after or thinking about the day after tomorrow, which is, am I in the right business? What is my future business? Who are going to be my competitors? Yes. Should I have a different business model? Should I, come out with a completely different set of products and services? Now that's the conversation. So even in the same thing on the board, we do the annual, the quarterly annual. There's a lot of discussion around the strategy, what went right, what didn't go right, what are we going to be doing, new markets which we should be going into, given the current situation and the pandemic. How should we evolve? What processes should we change? Those discussions take place. And I guess at the present moment, the focus is really much on the present and perhaps a little bit about, let's say post March 21. But I think the true purpose of the board really should be to constantly keep focusing with binoculars on the future. How should the company come out of this crisis? So one of the companies, for example, TCN as the clothing company, we've actually defined what is going to happen between now and March 21. And more important, we're trying to define in what shape we should be in when we come out of March 21. And then we are looking at what outside of that, because retail buying is going to change completely. People's purchasing behaviors are going to change. Therefore, are we in the right business with the right kind of channels, or should we be looking at completely different nodes on which we should be selling? I think, even in the case of State Bank of India, I think one of the biggest realizations is that what can we do for SME and financial inclusion much more than what we are currently doing. And perhaps that is also a future source for growth, especially from a rural perspective. So, but I think that that's really one of the most important functions of the board, is really the strategic thinking. But we spend a lot more time on, the quarterly results, as well as the regulatory and compliance requirements.
Ms. Kripalu?
So, actually, it's similar. As you said, there are three components. One is the operational part, which actually normally the management takes care of. And then there's strategy and there's governance. I guess we can't afford to stop short on governance for reasons we all know, both whether times are good or times are bad. When it comes to strategy, typically when you have one strategy meeting every year where they take you through strategy, and good organizations will then use like a scorecard to tell you how they've got to and where they've got to in that strategic framework. This year, what happened was that people who presented in March, the strategy was irrelevant in April.
That's true.
Because everything changed.
Yep.
Your behavior changed, your categories became irrelevant. So how do you pivot at that point in time to be relevant? And then suddenly, clearly you have to manage the short term to get your long term right. But then you still have to manage the short term. So what do you do in the short term, which is constructive for the future and not just destructive? Because it's very easy to cut your way out of a crisis. How do you grow your way out of a crisis? For example, is this the time for strong brands to focus on what we call market share? Not worry too much about what's happening in the category, but at least say that, look, within what I have, I'm doing fine. Yep. How do I keep my people motivated during a crisis? That becomes another issue because people are at home. Encourage, as an independent director, encourage management to communicate, see if there's any benefit they can give to the world at large. For example, one of the companies I'm on the board of, they made 5 lakh PPE kits. What happened is they got paid a bit. The government paid them. So that covered their operational costs of running factories, etc. So they were able to pay their employees. But most importantly, the employees got a hell of a lot of pride in, I'm talking about April, which was about 3 months ago, that our organization is doing something really constructive. Now, it was really the initiative of the management, egged on by the independent directors, that actually made this happen. So, you know, these are the kind of areas in which independent directors can help think a bit out of the box, bring outside-in thinking and say, hey, is there something we can do? They then got on to making some masks as well, etc., etc. So there are many ways in which you can add value during a crisis. Of course, you have to hold their hand, help them do this process. But ultimately, there has to be light at the end of the tunnel. The business you're in, if it doesn't have light at the end of the tunnel, then that's a different case altogether.
Okay. And Mr. Dutta, your response to the question.
Actually, whatever had to be said has been said. So I had my two penny with.
Does this also happen in board meetings?
No, you still had your 2 penny with. You see, more. I mean, there is a board meeting and there is outside of the board. There is significant amount of discussions that happen outside of the board, and it is a continuous process on whether it's a strategy, whether it's a new idea, whether it's compliance, whether it's people, whether it's something that is bothering the management. So you actually have this ongoing dialogue which happens at times, you know, even weekly, even there's no calendar for it. So that's one part of value that directors add, because you actually hold the mirror to the promoter or to the CEO or to the CFO, whoever the person may be, and that's one level of value that you add. And a lot of that is strategic. Some of it is operational, and some of it is, like you said, governance. And the role I play in most companies is that of governance, given my background and given all the work that I have done in governance in the last 20 years. So, but then again, in strategy, what you do is you ask basic questions and you actually go and evaluate and help come up with common sense questions. At the end of the day, question and whether the emperor has got clothes or not. So there are different roles that different people.
Sometimes you figure out, is there an emperor? Who's the emperor? Who's the empress? Who's the heir to the emperor? All those kind of questions come into play.
Absolutely, and who's going to clothe the emperor?
Yes, that's also important.
Exactly. So it's not what I'm saying is that is not one thing. It's multiple things at multiple places, and it's different things that one evolves into the other, and other evolves into another thing. At the end of the day, you're like Neelam said, you're trying your best to give back wealth to the shareholders. And since, like, as independent directors, you have no pecuniary interest in the wealth that is being created, because that's why you're independent.
You know, that brings me into a related question, is that there is a clear line between boards and management. And so how can the boards get the management to think?
Sunandan, let me answer that. 73% of the companies in India are actually owned owned by a family that runs it, right? I mean, this is a PwC survey in 2019.
Sure.
If you take the
worldwide also, I think worldwide that figure holds true as well.
Yeah, even if we take the NSE or BSE 50, Nifty 50, 16 out of the 50 companies are family owned. So what I'm saying is that between the promoter and the management, the agency gap in India is very narrow. So whatever is the promoter and the management are kind of interchangeable. So when that happens, this, unlike like when you have distributor shareholding, let's say in Infosys or in a GE, you have a difference between the owners and the managers are different. But in India, in most times, the owners and the managers are the same, or the same set of individuals. That brings me to another comment from what Neelam was saying. So when independent directors get appointed, because the owners own or the promoters own majority, they are actually voting you in. Unlike in a distributed company ownership, it's all shareholders put together. So even though it's independent, it does need a nod from the majority ownership.
So my question, Kaushik, is more from a strategic point of view. I mean, boards should get the CEO and the management to think, right? Sukanya?
So can I just add here, because I think this is a moot point where really there is no clear answer. Who's responsible for strategy? And frankly, the best, at least answer I've seen anywhere, is that it is actually a joint effort. But it is management which has to own the strategy, and therefore they have to present it based on inputs from the board. And then after the strategy is presented, the board gives them questions with healthy skepticism so that they modify it. But if the board says that this is the strategy and then passes it on to management, chances are they will not own it and it will fail. So therefore, this is one area where you have to have a very balanced approach. And my experience has been, please allow, whatever you may have, let the management own the strategy, give your views, suggest options and alternatives, ensure that they're looking at the right risk and the right opportunities, and then let them go, or feel that they own it, make sure that they own it, and then they go out and actually implement it.
Bhaskar, that's exactly the point I was making, actually, because, get these guys to think, get the management to think, right? That's the whole idea.
I don't think I think we are denigrating the management.
No, not denigrating. I'm not saying get everybody to debate it and therefore look at from the pros and cons of looking at every strategy.
I would believe that some of the most successful companies, it has been because they had excellent executive management with very supportive boards.
Yes, of course.
But I find it very difficult to believe that you have a very excellent company which was driven completely by the board.
I think I love that. Sunandan, I want to ask a question which has been in my mind. I couldn't send it to you, but I think it's the most, and I want real answers. The people on this board are people who speak their mind with sensitivity and compassion. Give us examples of boards that you turned down. And why do you turn down? Even if the company was well known, even if it was profitable, it seemed to be prestigious to be on the board from outside, but you still turned it down. So what do you look at? People like you must be offered many boards. I know there's a limit, so you have to choose. But give us examples of companies you chose, why you chose them, and companies that you refuse to be on the board in spite of being wooed. Because I think that will explain your role also in some way, and your own expectations from how the board should be now. So we can start with Ms. Dhawan.
Anurag, this is a good question for me because I do consider myself to be very picky on which boards I look at. I want to be on boards where I can add value, where I have the skill set to make the difference. And every board, you can't make a difference. Two, when you meet the chairman and you meet some of the other board members, can I work with them and contribute the way I would like to contribute? You know, in the first few meetings, by meeting the chairman, meeting the board members, you form an opinion that is this the organization, is this the board which allows you to speak what is in your mind? I mean, nobody wants me just to look pretty, right? You talked about diversity on the panel and otherwise in the boards, but they don't want women to look pretty. They want us to add value, and I firmly believe I add value with my experience and my knowledge and what I have to bring to the table to these boards. So I do select based on my experience. I do select based on whether I found it comfortable to talk to the people who are on the board and will they give me the freedom to talk. The other thing which I found is the size of the canvas. I find, you know, there's so many companies which are starting up, they're going into AI, they're going into robotics, and they're doing exciting stuff, and they want you on their board. But I find that size of the canvas, I'm unable to adapt to it and then contribute to it. So I evaluate it from where I can actually, you know, work and give them the right guidance. That's how I look at it. And there have been many instances where I've turned down. It's from an industry I don't understand. I don't respect the executives or the board members. And I find I'm not going to be able to contribute. And I just say no.
Okay. Ms. Kripalu?
So I have some other criteria also to look at, to be honest. Unlike Kaushik, I'm not a finance person. So I look at companies, my first cut is that I should have absolutely no doubt about governance, about anything that I'm expected to know, do, etc., etc. So that's my first cut, because I'll be honest, I'm not a finance person. If somebody brings me a very well-bound report and said, hey, these were the accounts for last quarter, I don't have the capability, that's not my background, to be able to figure out whether I've got the right numbers or not. So for me, the first criteria is trust, the ability to get on, and to be clear that I can forget about the governance part and contribute to the strategy part. It's not that I don't do governance, I don't ask it, but it's not my core competence. So I do believe that governance and compliance is a very important part of boards. May not be to the extent of what Bhaskar was saying in SBI of 80%, it shouldn't be, but there is a part to it which is very, very important. And I have to be first convinced that that is run kosher.
Okay. Mr. Dutta?
The first is chemistry, that you, like everything that you said, that, you know, whether you have a gut that, you know, you'll get along. Second is governance, which are in the way I look at it, it's safety, because you don't want to get into a board in which you become unsafe, and because today being in a board has got both civil and criminal liabilities, so it's safety. And then comes, you know, that does it, I mean, is there any value that you would be bringing in apart from, you know, the governance part in which you can contribute? And if there's an answer to all those is a tick, then you say yes.
Okay.
So, you know, I think everybody's sort of said, so I have all the different elements which everybody has spoken of, but primarily for me, in order of priority, it is the history of governance. It's the trust, which I feel with the management, with the other board members, you know, based on that understanding. And the third I actually look for is, what is the challenge and the opportunity to, you know, to be part of the board of the company. And that to me is the very exciting, in a sense that what can I do to make them have far greater impact in the field of endeavor in which they are. So that opportunity piece is something which I find exciting. But it starts with governance, history of governance. It starts with what is the trust I feel with the organization, with the management, with the other board members, and then it is the opportunity.